Hello, I'm Father Nick Henshaw. I'm the Vicar of St Thomas's here in Groombridge in East Sussex. This is part of our Lent course, or an additional part of our Lent course here at Groombridge this year, and also, of course, is on Father Nick Thinking Out Loud on YouTube. The reason I'm recording this extra one is because both in one of the live Lent groups and in somebody who talked to me after a discussion they'd had, the question of the translation of Psalms came up, or different versions of the Psalms. I talked a bit about that in one of the Lent groups, but it deserves some attention, shall we say. It deserves some attention because it's a big issue. It's a big issue. I need to say two things to start with, something about different kinds of translation, and that really matters. Essentially, certainly with biblical texts, and indeed with other kinds of texts, but particularly with biblical texts, there are essentially two very different approaches to translating an ancient text, be that Greek or Hebrew. The first is what we might call literal translation, where you seek to express as clearly as possible what these words mean in the right kind of grammatic context for today. So sticking as closely as possible to the sense of the original text. The second is called dynamic equivalence. And dynamic equivalence is essentially trying to express in today's language something that is equivalent to what would have been true for the first hearers of that text. Now, this may sound quite surprising, but the best example of the contrast between those are between two different translations of the Bible, both of them widely used in the contemporary world. One, the New Revised Standard Version, and one, the New International Version. Both perfect or respectful translations with different kinds of emphasis, but the New Revised Standard Version, a very good example of what you might call the literal approach to translation, it seeks to do precisely that, which is why internationally it's respected as the most accurate in terms of academic study of the Bible. In most universities in North America, certainly until recently, it's been seen as the only Bible you can use for academic study. By contrast, the New International Version chose the approach of dynamic equivalence, i.e. trying to express in today's modern language the kind of concepts that might have been true for those original readers. Neither of those is better or worse than the other, although many different people have strong opinions either way. So they're both there, but particularly with the Psalms, which we'll come to in a moment, you see those approaches, shall we say, very clearly delineated and having an influence on the way Psalms express the biblical text. So that's something about approaches to translation, and we'll pop up with a few more of those later on. But why is it that of all the books in the Bible, the Psalms have had the most translations ever of any book? At first that seems, the Psalms, they're not the Gospels, they're not the Exodus, they're not the Law, so why would Psalms have had so many different translations? Well, the fascinating way into this question, I think, is to look into the history of some of those translations. And one thing that really stands out in almost every Christian tradition about the Psalms, and that's this, that Christians, of course, have developed different translations of the Bible over centuries, but almost always they have used a different translation of the Psalms for actual worship. Let me say that again. Christians down the centuries have had the Bible, and often a single version of the Bible, but again and again they've used a different translation from the Bible one for the Psalms. Let me give you an example, a very clear example in the Anglican tradition. The King James Bible, which was kind of the standard Bible for many centuries in the UK and indeed other countries, it stands very clearly as a major document of faith. It's had a massive influence on the English language worldwide and is still used in many, many churches. But when it came to the translation of the Psalms that were going to be used in the prayer book, known as the Book of Common Prayer, the church at that time of the Reformation said, no, we're not going to use the one in the Bible. That just doesn't have enough grit in it. We're going to use another one. And they used a version of the Psalms that had been translated by Miles Coverdale. And the difference there is, twofold in a sense. Miles Coverdale's translation of the Psalms, which will be very familiar to many lifelong Anglicans because they'll have heard those Psalms regularly at various services over a lifetime. is that the Coverdale version, A, has a bit more grit in it. Some of its imagery is a bit more gritty, but also very clearly in that period of great change in the church, they were much better adapted to being sung texts, And as I've said already in this course, the word psalm simply means something sung. So singing the psalms has been the normal mode of using the psalms in worship. So when those reformers were getting to grips with the new Bible, it's fascinating to note they made the decision, as has happened again and again in the history of Christianity, to actually use a different translation of the Psalms because of the qualities needed for a sung text. Oh, right. So that's why, that's a commonality in so many traditions, that a sung text has different demands on translation than something that's simply going to be read. Of course, it's a bit different in our own day, where the singing of the Psalms has taken a back seat. I think that's a real shame, and I think there are ways we might address that going forward. Probably not today, but that's another matter. So I just want to talk about various translations that are either current or have been used in the past, and why they're interestingly different, but also telling, essentially, of course, the same text. They're telling the same story. They are the same Psalms. Although sometimes the divergences between translations are very interesting. Here we have the Book of Common Prayer, the Book of Common Prayer. I've already referred to this. This is one of the most venerable texts in terms of the way churches of all sorts of traditions, mostly Anglican, have used the Psalms. They have the Psalms set out, Coverdale Psalms, as I said, in a very clear way, and they are read in the Book of Common Prayer tradition through in a month. And you basically start at the beginning and go to the end. It's not quite as simple as that, but pretty much. It's a way of reading the Psalms that's disciplined, methodical, and of course, for many centuries, was sung. They were sung. You'd sing the Psalms in the evening, the Psalms in the morning. Many would comment, and the Wessex novels of Thomas Hardy would give a real eye-opener into this, that very many people, because they were going to morning and evening prayer regularly, sometimes daily, knew the Psalms by heart. It wasn't occasional, it was quite normal for people to do that. Not clergy necessarily, but all sorts of people. And certainly they would be imbibing these extraordinary texts. And because they were sung, and because they were a very resonant translation, they became easier and easier for particularly a non-literate culture to get to know by heart. I think a lovely phrase, that by heart. I really regret, my parents' generation, they knew loads of poetry by heart. My generation, we don't. It's not what we do. But these sung texts of the Psalms are a way in which they begin to get to grips with our heart and our mind and somehow bring those together. Book of Common Prayer, a really good example of that, simply because it's been used for centuries and centuries. Let me turn to a very different translation. This is the monastic antiphona. This brings together all the Psalms that are sung in the Benedictine office. That's 7 times a day, so it's quite a lot of singing. But with the music is printed as part of the text. And so you cannot get away from the fact this is a sung text. Okay, it's sung in Latin, so not entirely inclusive in our modern culture, but giving different tunes and different ways of expressing it for different seasons. A remarkable achievement. And of course, there are still communities that do worship in Latin, even in the UK. But it's really interesting that even in those communities, they quite relatively recently produced another new translation of the Latin Psalms, because they felt previous ones were simply not up to it. Indeed, in the Middle Ages, in the Latin Church, monks rebelled against the terrible barbarity of the Latin translation that they'd received in the Bible, and they wanted something much more sophisticated. So all sorts of things impinge on what's necessary, or what seemed to be necessary, in the Psalms. But as I say, fundamental to the reason why there are so many versions of the Psalms is because their nature as a sung text used in worship for praise and thanksgiving, rather than as a pedagogical tune. They're not there to teach people things so much as to invite people to imbibe these extraordinary truths in these sung texts. Another one, this may be familiar to some of you, the Psalms from Taizé. This is their own translation and very influenced by the French tradition, because Taizé is in France. And these are a very simple way of expressing the Psalms. Taizé, if you've ever encountered it, is a community of about 120, 130 monks from all over the world and all sorts of different denominations, currently with an Anglican leader. And it's a place where literally tens of thousands of young people gather every summer. It's quite extraordinary part of that. You'd be sitting in a church with 6,000 other people chanting and singing. And the use of the Psalms there is very moving because it's it's a deeply communal exercise in the way that hymn singing can sometimes be in our own tradition. As part of that whole Taizé thing, this is the Grail Psalter. And the Grail Psalter was produced in the 20th century by a group by a religious order. As a way of actually singing the Psalms in a new way. You won't be able to see this, but those are the tones that the Psalms are sung to that you can find at the back. And those were written by a musician called Gélineau. And they've been interesting. They haven't been universally easy for some traditions to work with, partly because different languages work in different ways. But the Gélineau Psalms have a very important place in the traditions of music and the Psalms. And so we've got these texts, these extraordinary poetic texts, where music is fundamental to how they're translated, and indeed some of the psalms themselves, as we've seen in the session so far, have music built into them. They have musical instructions built into them. Sometimes there's a sung response built into the psalm. Now we may not use the psalms in that way ourselves, but they're there to bring this alive. I'm not going to try singing to you at this moment. Maybe I will before the end. But it actually makes a difference. Well, I will do. Let's give this a go. This is my favourite version of the Psalms. This is the 1990s, a translation produced by ISOL, which is an international commission on English in the liturgy, an extraordinarily influential body. And they produced this, although later it is no longer published, which is a tragedy, because I think it is the finest modern translation of the Psalms. But let's just have a look at the influence of music on a psalm. I'm going to have a look at a couple of psalms in here. I'm going to start with one of the most famous and in some ways the saddest, the By the Waters of Babylon, which I know was made famous by Boney M, of course. And it's a psalm of lament in the deepest possible way. It can be sung to all sorts of chants, but I'm just going to use this very simple chant. It's tone 2, if that helps anybody, of Plainsong. Plainsong has 8 different tones, and they just have slight variations. By the rivers of Babylon we sat weeping, remembering Zion. There on the poplars we hung harps. A captor shouted for happy songs, for songs of festival. Sing, they cried, the songs of Zion. How could we sing the song of the Lord in a foreign land? Jerusalem forgotten, whither my hand? Jerusalem forgotten, silence my voice, if I do not seek you as my greatest joy. So that's a very ancient chant. That chant goes back to, well, who knows when. Plainsong comes from a very, very ancient tradition. I'm going to do something slightly different now, Psalm 51. Psalm 51, one of the greatest of the Psalms in the sense it's been used again and again in so many different contexts. A psalm particularly used in Lent, indeed in the Church, in the Church of England's daily prayer. Verses from Psalm 51 are used every day at morning prayer throughout Lent. I'm going to sing the opening of this beautiful psalm. A psalm of penance, a psalm of regret, and a psalm of hope, I guess. I'm going to sing this to a modern chant by Dom Gregory Murray. Dom Gregory Murray was a Roman Catholic monk in Berkshire who did an awful lot of work on new ways of singing the psalms. Fair enough. He wrote all sorts of stuff. So this is this beautiful psalm, part of it, sung to that modern chant. Have mercy, tender God, forget that I defied you. Wash away my sin, cleanse me from my guilt. I know my evil well, it stares me in the face. Evil done to you alone, before your very eyes. I'll write your condemnation, your verdict clearly just. You see me for what I am, a sinner before my birth. You love those centered in truth, teach me your hidden wisdom. Wash me with fresh water, wash me bright as snow. That's a chant I've been singing with, in both personally and in communities for decades, literally, going back to my student days. And so it still has that kind of power. But I think that's important too. I think singing the Psalms is also a way not just of interiorizing them, the head and the heart, if you like, getting to grips with the Psalms, so they become part of us rather than something we're singing or doing. The music itself is a binding mechanism somehow. In a sense, yes, giving praise, but it's also a way in which the memory gets its head around these words, and they become a real resource in a life. That's something I'm very keen on in talking about the Psalms, is a recognition that isn't just Psalm 23, however beautiful it is, the Lord is my shepherd, I need nothing more. It's psalms of lament, psalms of hope, psalms of praise, psalms of sorrow, psalms that invite us into the deepest darkness, and psalms that liberate us simply to sing praise. Let me share another one from here. This is a different chant altogether by a Franciscan friar. And this is for Psalm 63. Specifically, it works for Psalm 63. It doesn't work for many others. And this is a much more melodic chant. There's much more variation in the melody. Again, this is a wonderful psalm, although for those of us who've been talking these through in the Lent groups, it has some cursing verses at the end, which I'm not going to sing this time, but are part of the psalm. God, my God, you I crave, my soul thirsts for you, my body aches for you, like a dry and weary land. Let me gaze on you in your temple, a vision of strength and glory. Your love is better than life, my speech is full of praise. I give you a lifetime of worship, my hands raised in your name. I feast at a rich table, my lips sing of your glory. On my bed I lie awake, your memory fills the night. You have been my help, I rejoice beneath your wings. Yes, I cling to you, your right hand holds me fast. I find that almost prayerful and extraordinary songs of desire. Sing love songs to God, love songs to God. That's what some of these psalms are, love songs to God. Quite extraordinary and deeply moving. Let me make a few comments that are problematic. Not problematic, they're just part of this journey of translation and getting the right psalms. For many years I used the psalms in this book. This is the American Prayer Book, American Anglican Prayer Book, one of the finest works of modern liturgy ever produced in 1976. A wonderful book, incredible source book. A bit different from Church of England's Common Worship, but very much the same family. And the translation of the Psalms here was seen to be really, really groundbreaking. And I wish we'd have adopted them when the Church of England produced Common Worship. What Church of England did, and I really have problems with this, is they took the American Psalter, which is an amazing piece of work and has been used in all sorts of different denominations and contexts, and they just made it a bit more old-fashioned. And I really struggle with that, not because I'm terribly modern, not because I desperately want everything to be radically new, but because I think the American Psalter had such power and such authority and had been really thought, and again as a sung text. And then the one in Common Worship is a rather blunter and intentionally slightly more old-fashioned one. So which would I go for? Well, the truth is, I mean, I've made it clear, haven't I? I love the old monastic book up here, but obviously we're not going to be chanting in Latin very much. That's not quite where we are, is it? This book here, this is my favourite Psalter, as I said, and a beautiful edition as well. You can see this has been everywhere because it's got all sorts of broken bits on it. I think this is the finest modern translation. It's also deeply inclusive. which I think is terribly, very, very important. I know that there are certain powers that be that can't bear the DEI inclusion sort of understanding, but I think it's really important in the Psalms and in our worship. It has been superseded in America by the new Abbey Psalter. The Abbey Psalter is an updating of another Psalter. Again, I'm not sure you can do that. I think like this, you have to sort of sit down and just say, right, you know, this is amazing. Let's work with Hebrew scholars and poets and musicians and work together to produce something extraordinary, which is what this is all about. And I think that's what the Psalms are all about. And for me, this is great. I'm just very sorry that it's no longer commercially available, because I think that robs the churches of a real and powerful resource. I'll finish with a few comments about different translations of the Psalms for other reasons. I think it's really important that we engage with the text and with a text that is genuinely a translation of the Hebrew. That may sound a really strange thing to say, but I think it really is important, because I think one of the things that's happened quite often with Psalms is when a new version has come along, as I suggested with the American Psalter, it's very easy to say, well, but we love that line. Why can't we still have that? Well, often because an old translation simply didn't get the Hebrew right. I think one of the best examples, although I don't want to disturb people with this, is in Psalm 46, where traditionally we have the line, be still and know that I am God. And you think, oh, lovely, what a beautiful... In fact, Michael Ramsey, the great Archbishop of Canterbury, wrote a book called Be Still and Know That I Am God. Yeah, it's a beautiful phrase. Except that's not what the Psalm says. And that's quite frustrating. It's quite frustrating. The great Hebrew scholar Robert Alter, in his commentary on the Psalms, makes it very clear that what that line in the Psalm means is stop fighting. Stop fighting. That's rather different from be still and know that I am God. And because the Psalms are poetic, their poetic resonance, of course, leads us down those paths very easily. But actually in Psalm 46, which we're not looking at in the Lent course this year, but here's a moment with it, Psalm 46 is all about battle and strife and things going wrong. And in the middle of the psalm, God says, stop it! Stop an end to your fighting. That's the best translation really around. That's Robert Alter's translation. Not be still and know that I am God, which feels, oh great, we'll just be still and God will speak to us. Of course God speaks to us in the silence. That's really important. That's not what Psalm 46 is about. It's about the hard-won business of finding space in the battle, finding refuge in God. And you know, those are issues in the Psalms where translation can sometimes hark back to a previous generation or to a previous translation because we could have liked the sound of that, when I think it's really important to grapple with the text as it really is. Enough. I simply wanted in this talk this extra talk, this additional talk, to alert us to some of the wonderful variety of the Psalms and the Psalms translations, but also to hold on to that complexity. You know, translation is a very, very complex art. And we are very well served by so many great translators in producing these Psalms, and some great poets. You know, C.S. Lewis was involved in the production of one book of the Psalms. I think that's great. Musicians are often involved in the production of Psalm books. Absolutely fantastic. We need all these extraordinary gifts around the table. And but above all, we need to dive into the Psalms. Dive into the Psalms. You know, in some traditions, you say the Psalms every week. In early traditions, every day. Now, nobody's expecting that at all. But these are texts to immerse yourself in, to find the deepest beauty, even in some of the terribly ugly things that are said in the Psalms, as an extraordinary stairway to heaven. And I don't mean that as a joke. I mean that stairway to an opening up of the eyes of our minds to the Lord, who is the Lord of everything. And these Psalms give wings to our praises.